From the studios of TLC Talk Radio, it's Tasha Talks. I'm your girl, Tasha. And of course, we have an incredible show lined up for you today. Don't forget to follow us on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. And of course, check us out on TLCTalkRadio.com, 24/7 edutainment. We have on the line my friend, journalist Jason Palmer. And we want to discuss the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Hello, Tasha. How are you?
I'm well. We miss you on the show, but I know you've been busy.
Yeah, busy is putting mildly what I'm dealing with right now.
I was about to say, particularly now. So we went from, and we haven't left it, but we went from pandemic to this, and it's just been crazy. So to recap, George Floyd was murdered by former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin and 3 others who did nothing to serve and protect Mr. Floyd. And Chauvin pressed his knee onto a handcuffed Floyd for over 8 minutes, violating both police policy and Mr. Floyd's rights. And the aftermath has been varied and swift and just a lot happening at once. And for Black people, we're exhausted, I think that's a fair statement to make. So 4 officers were fired. His wife filed for divorce. And the reports say, I heard some talk, Jason, that people were saying, oh, she's doing that to protect her assets. But my understanding is that she didn't want any spousal support or anything of that nature. I think she did want the house, but that I have to double check on that. But let's talk about the firing of these 4 officers. What can you tell us?
Sure. Pretty much that angle of the story has been pretty much reported pretty good. The decision was made by the chief of police, Alon. It was supported by the mayor. So the mayor of Minneapolis is Jacob Frey. Mm-hmm. And Chief Arando is his name. He's the first African-American chief in the history of the Minneapolis Police Department. And just to give people a little bit of history regarding this agency, the Minneapolis Police Department has had a long history of systemic racism within it. They've had a number of high-profile cases with Jamal Clark, which was a young Black man who was shot and killed by police, and people there in Minnesota say he was murdered. Then we had the situation a couple of years ago where there was a Somalian-American police officer who shot a white Australian lady, and it caused an international controversy. That officer was convicted of third-degree murder and is currently serving 12 years in prison. Mm-hmm. And people in Minnesota and around the country have said that's a perfect example of the difference in justice up there in Minnesota. So, I lived there for about a year and a half, moved from there in 2018, shortly after Philando Castile was murdered by another police officer. That was in suburban Minnesota, suburban Minneapolis. So there's a history there with this. In this particular case, it was so egregious, the former officer's actions, that once the chief and pretty much anyone else looked at the videos, and there are about 2 or 3 different angles, they quickly made the correct decision in firing everyone involved. And so the problem is right now is that those other 3 officers they fired have not been arrested or charged with anything. Mm-hmm. And, you said in the opening that they're actually complicit. They allowed it to happen. Yep. They actually sat there and allowed it to happen and didn't try to stop it. And a number of my law enforcement friends have told me it's quite simple. When you place someone in custody, meaning you have them in handcuffs and they're in custody, they're not your responsibility. Their safety and well-being is your responsibility. Yeah. He was in custody. He was handcuffed. He was pinned to the ground. At that point, his health and well-being is up to all of them. Mm-hmm. And they all failed in that. And all 4 of them need to be charged. And that's currently what we're waiting for. But the chief took the actions that he could take at the moment, which was to fire the officers. Yeah. The investigation is currently with the Hennepin County District Attorney's Office. And they have to be the one that bring the charges and say, okay, go arrest these guys. So it's not the chief's call on this. If it was up to him, they would have been probably arrested that day he fired them. But we just have to see what this state's attorney does.
Yeah. And, obviously around the country, there have been many protests, peaceful protests, and, a lot of concern. You have the people who are out there to obviously do the peaceful protest. You have the people who are out there to agitate and instigate and make the movement, particularly Black Lives Matter, look bad. I'm sitting here in my Black Lives Matter earrings because they do indeed matter. And there's been, in my opinion, just watching the news coverage, and I mentioned to you pre-show that I've had a hard time watching all of it. I know I have to remain informed because, 1, I need to know, and 2, this is what I do. But I struggled with watching it, but I noticed a distinction that was different to me. It felt different. It seemed different in the way that the news reporters were making a distinction between the protesters and those who were there to take advantage of a bad situation. What were your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts on this have actually been evolving since the protests started around this country last week. Yeah. And I think this is what's confusing everyone. There's something darker going on here, is the simplest way to put it. They're not protesters and they're rioters. They're protesters, they're rioters, but they're also anarchists, and they're also white supremacists involved. Yeah. So you've got 4 completely different agendas taking place in one event. And I think that is what is causing so much confusion around the country right now. People can't wrap their minds around this. So you have the people who are out there protesting what happened to Mr. Floyd. Right. And they are out there, making demands, they're saying, hey, this is going on too much. You have peaceful protesters, okay? Then you have actual rioters and people who are breaking laws and taking advantage of the situation for their own personal opportunity. Sure. So that's a separate group. That's the second group. Then you have a third group, which are the anarchists. These people just don't like government in general, and they are taking advantage of Mr. Floyd's death and the protests around it to get their message out that the government is terrible, we need to start completely over, and they are the ones that are out there burning post offices, attacking government targets. They put Nashville City Hall was on fire. That's the work of the anarchists. And then there's a 4th group, and this is the hardest one for our people to actually wrap their minds around, but they need to understand it and do it as quickly as possible. There are white supremacists out here who are joining these protests under the guise of, hey, yeah, what they did to Mr. Floyd is terrible. And they are just vandalizing businesses and property in Black neighborhoods on purpose. Yeah. So there are 4 different elements in this one event. And that's the thing we need to get people to understand. The white supremacists are out there, the anarchists are out there, the protesters are out there, and then the lawless people are out there. Those are the 4 different aspects taking place. And so, I live in Wisconsin. I live down, by the Illinois border, and we had an incident in Kenosha 2 days ago where Black Lives Matter protesters were protesting peacefully with a police escort through Kenosha, no problems. On 2 occasions, white residents of Kenosha came out of their homes with guns, threatening people. One person who we've now determined is a white supremacist came out with an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, pointed it at the group, and was threatening to shoot people. Fortunately, the police were there. They immediately took this guy into custody, and he's currently being held in Kenosha County Jail waiting a bond hearing. So that element is out there. Yeah. that element is out there. And I know a lot of black people in 2020 are thinking, that stuff was almost over in the 60s. Well, we need to get our heads wrapped around the reality of this world right now.
Yeah.
There's a political climate, there's a social climate, there's an economic climate, there's a mental health climate, there's a COVID disease out there. This situation has been brewing for months, and I've been telling people about this, those who follow me. I've been predicting this pretty much every step of the way. You could see it coming. If you study human history, if you understand a little bit about human sociology and psychology, you can see this coming. Mr. Floyd's tragic murder was the match that lit the gasoline that was connected to the dynamite, which was sitting on top of the nuclear bomb.
Wow.
And everything has now gone up.
Yeah, that's an analogy for you, and it's accurate. Absolutely accurate. And so you're right. People have to be careful, and I had a conversation with a relative yesterday who told me I was crazy when I said exactly what you said, that, hey, this is not the way it appears. It's not just, people rolling by trying to loot the liquor store. It's not just that. There's something else, like you said, something much darker coming through.
Yeah, it's definitely a more sinister approach. And so as I relate to your question about the media, I think those of us in the media, and especially the television news media, it took us a while to figure it out. And, the first clues of it was actually what was happening in Minnesota. After the second day of the riots, their police and their governor came out and said, hey, this is some coordinated stuff. We've covered protests before. We've even had some civil unrest. This is nothing like that. And that was my first clue. Okay, there's something darker going on here. And they kind of put it out there of how coordinated the event seemed to be. You started a fire here so that they send a troop of cops here, and then you attack in other areas. And, I knew it was different when they took over a police station. When they commandeered the 3rd district, the 3rd precinct up there in Minneapolis, I knew it was something really kind of darker going on here. But I think, the media also, the way they've covered this thing has not been perfect. I've got some issues with the media in general right now, and I'll give you a perfect example. So last week, Channel 2 in Chicago, WBBM, laid off a number of reporters.
I saw.
One of those was Pam Zeckman,
wow,
who is a longtime investigative reporter, like one of the top in the business.
Yeah, it
got laid off.
Floored me. Yeah,
right. And it's more producers, newsroom people. So the coverage is also a reflection of what we're dealing with in our industry, where we just don't have enough hands on deck. So during the serious rioting that was taking place in Chicago on Sunday, so there was obviously the riots that took place Saturday night in downtown Chicago. So basically every media outlet in Chicago, expecting the second outbreak of rioting, concentrated on downtown. Well, those of us who got street sense know they ain't going to go back to the place they just looted because, well, they just looted it. There's nothing left. So if you're forward thinking, you say, okay, it's obviously, you can read the temperature of society. It's going to keep going, but where is it going to spread out to?
Sure.
And for most of the morning and into the early afternoon, they were clearly focused on downtown. They were showing broken glass. In the meantime, the south side was going up.
Yeah.
I mean, it was going up bad. And there were literally riots taking place, and they were still downtown. Jim Williams of Channel 2 and I are actually pretty cool. He grew up in Chatham, which was the neighborhood I grew up in. He was live on air, and I was just sending a message like, Jim, y'all are missing the story. The story is not downtown. You showing me broken glass from the night before. The story is what is going on right now. And, he reached out kind of to me and said, hey, we're having trouble getting out there because they've shut down a lot of streets. I'm like, Jim, y'all got a helicopter.
Right.
Y'all got a helicopter.
Yeah.
And so eventually the news coverage did focus to the south side. But it was at least 2 hours after the stuff had really started. So, I think the media has been behind the 8 ball on a lot of this. It's something we haven't seen before. And I also think, it's a lot of, because of the cuts and things that have happened place in news media organizations around the country.
Sure.
So, that's in terms of just some of the coverage. But there's also been misidentification of some things. They'll come to the scene and say the people are rioting. In one case, the people were not rioting; they were actually cleaning up after the riot. So, I just think you have a lot of newer people in the news media because of the layoffs of a lot of experience, and that's why a lot of mistakes are happening in the media. That plus the fact that this is something like we have not seen in modern history before.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's absolutely accurate. You're right. If they can't get there or they don't even know to go there, like you said, are you forward thinking? Are you thinking about it? Absolutely. I'm not going back to the place that first of all, it's downtown Chicago. So if I'm of the criminal element, I ain't going back down there. They're probably ready to protect that. We caught them off guard the first time. It's not going to be a second run, but you're right. And so it moved. My parents are in Inglewood. And so a friend of mine, we both live in the South Burbs. She popped up early in the morning. She said, "Are your parents good on groceries?" And I was like, "I think so, but you're right. Let me go to the store." And so my way, I'm really close to Indiana. I popped up. I did a lot of shopping for my parents, and I drove it to Inglewood early in the morning because I didn't know what shutdowns were going to be like, and I wanted to get back, to my area. And then, sure enough, I started getting those notes about what time curfews were going to hit because, again, I wasn't following the news, and it was an evolving situation. So, sure, you're absolutely right about that. I wanted things to be what they were. And as I drove through Inglewood, when I got off the expressway, I just saw things. I was literally there. I do the live streaming for our church. We're not gathering everyone. But because I have to go to church on Sunday, I had just driven through the area. When I got off the expressway Monday morning to see, to check on my parents, it was just a very different look. And I was like, I know darn well I was just here yesterday. So lots to cover. What has been your thoughts on the reaction of people? So here's what I've noticed on Facebook. I've seen a lot of solidarity from white friends and associates. I've seen a lot of calling out. A friend of mine, I won't say his name, but he literally started tagging his white friends and saying, "Why are you silent on this?" What has been the response that you've seen on social media or even just in real life when you talk with people of other races? Because it's been more like we were whining, like we were just complaining, like these were one-offs, whereas we know these things are systemic, they've been happening. And so now what I've kind of seen, I'll give you an example. Today, I opened my T-Mobile Tuesday. They give away free stuff, right? And so it was 40% off and free shipping at Reebok. Okay, well, let me go to Reebok.com. As I opened it, there was this message that acknowledged the plight of Black Americans. And it floored me. It's simple. I know it's accurate, but I couldn't believe the last time I'd seen a company take a stance like that was Nike with Colin Kaepernick and Ben & Jerry when Black Lives Matter initially started. Those were the only two companies that I recall seeing really actively taking a stand. So has there been a difference in your estimation?
Well, I think there's a different reaction on this one because the video was so egregious, where any person could look at that. I mean, even Fox News, for Christ's sake, was like, "Jesus Christ, this is illegal." Right. I mean, it's Fox News, and even they were like, "Holy crap, these guys are terrible." Right. We have seen that. We've seen more major companies come up and make statements. I think a part of that is one, they realize African Americans are part of their customer base. Two, I believe African Americans have ascended in a lot of these large companies and corporations into now management positions. I think we're at that point in history where our people are moving up in a lot of these business worlds. So a lot of us are actually have seats at the table. Yeah. And we can do things ourselves. We don't have to wait for the company to do things. We can initiate a lot of this stuff ourselves. So yes, I have seen that. I think most of America is looking at this and saying we've got a problem. Yeah. And we have not addressed this problem since it started. We have not acknowledged it. President Clinton back in the day did issue an apology for enslaving Africans, or this country enslaving Africans. But, Tasha, the thing is, acknowledging it acknowledging the mistake is one thing.
That's right.
Fixing the problem is completely different.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah, you can acknowledge it publicly, and everybody's going to appreciate that, but that's not all you can do. You have to actually change this stuff. So that means when you have to, for instance, I use Illinois school districts and how they're funded as a perfect example. It's funded based off of property taxes.
Yeah.
Well, you know doggone well, if you live in a very affluent area, your school is going to be a lot better than if you live in one of the poor communities in the state of Illinois. We all know that.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that white people can do who live in these affluent areas is say, hey, we're getting rid of this law. We're going to come up with a new way to fund our public schools, since we know that education is a foundation and a predictor of how well people will do in society and how well they'll do in life. Like, you can increase your chances just by going to better schools.
Yep. I'm
okay.
a teacher, you know.
So I would actually prefer them more to change that than to be out there protesting with me, to be honest. That's something tangible you can do. And that's where we need to go through, and, you know, that's where the progress needs to be made on behalf of mainstream America and people of other races. If you really care, then you know what policies are racist. You know. Yeah. Redlining still takes place. Absolutely. Y'all know that. So, you know, if you're really serious about this stuff, then start making the policy changes and the fundamental changes in society that keep black people constantly fighting uphill. Yeah. You know, and I use gymnastics as a perfect example when I talk to people and white people all the time, and I'll be like, I don't cheer for the black people all the time because I'm racist. I cheer for the black people in sports competitions or whatever we're doing because I know how much harder it is for them.
Absolutely.
Simone Biles is the greatest gymnast in the world, not because she's talented, but because the difficulty in her routines that she performs is something other people cannot do. So you have to judge her differently and score her differently because her level of difficulty is much harder than every other gymnast out there. And that's how I view what black Americans deal with here in the United States. Our level of difficulty to reach achievement, starting from the moment we're born, going through the school system, going through the just different social situations you're put in, and then the law is always looking at you. You're constantly under the gun. You're constantly under stress. And if you can still thrive in that survivement, in that environment, then you have to give them more credit because their difficulty level was much higher than everyone else's.
Excellent. It reminds me of the meme of the two people running a race, and you know the white person has this straight shot, and the black person is at the same mark in life, but there are like 25,000 obstacles in her path.
That's right.
And people think, like I said earlier, they think we're whining, they think we're complaining, but no, this is legitimately, you know, our struggle. I tell this story often. When I was living at home, we smelled, I thought I smelled gas, called 911, the fire department came, and they literally, Jason, couldn't focus because they stopped as they walked into my parents' house and said, this is a really nice house. So for a second, my mother and I kind of looked at each other and said, is this a dream? You know, if Punk'd had been out, we'd have been looking around for Ashton Kutcher at the time, right? So we were like, what? They're like, man, it's really, really nice in here. First of all, gas leak. Let's focus. Right. Second of all, you walked in here with this preconceived notion. We were black. Right. We lived on 63rd Street. Well, they still live there. But we were floored because it was like, wait a minute, we work. You know, we want what we want, and people don't understand that something as basic as us having nice things in the house because my mother is HGTV TV before it ever came out, was something that surprised these white firemen. It illuminated what I had been taught my entire life. Absolutely.
Yep.
You made a statement on Facebook that I thought was really important. I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about how things can change. You said, as it relates to solutions, quote, if we want good cops to turn in bad ones, we have to provide the avenues and support system they need to do so safely. Now, that was profound. I was over here jumping up and down and shouting in my, Baptist girl dance. What might that look like?
So this is just me speaking from my creative side.
Sure.
So if the government is going to try, let's say, a mobster, and they need the witnesses, they understand what can happen to the witnesses. So what do they do to them?
Witness protection.
That's right. They put them in a witness protection program because they understand they're dealing with some very high-level organized crime people who will kill them. Say what you want. The law enforcement community is a gang. Okay? They're a gang. Now, you hope they're a good gang, but we've seen there's a lot of bad elements in there.
Sure.
Police officers, especially the black ones, are torn between sticking with the gang line and doing what's in the best interest of their community. It's always been that way.
Absolutely.
It's hard for them.
Yeah.
And it's not just the black ones, but again, as we just said, their level of difficulty is going to be higher in any organization.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you a couple of examples. An old school example is Serpico, who was a cop in New York City back in the 70s. It's a true story. He was a detective, and he basically turned in a bunch of dirty cops. As a result of his life being threatened, his career was lost. He had to deal with a bunch of stuff. But he's like, this stuff needs to stop. This corruption on the force needs to stop.
Yeah.
Okay? Let's fast forward that to the Laquan McDonald case. People forget that, Jason Van Dyke was convicted, but they also tried about 5 officers who lied as to what happened there on their reports. There was a police officer, a Hispanic officer, female, can't remember her name, Dora or something off the top of my head. She was the one who tricked on them. She was the one who said, hey, they falsified these reports. This is all wrong. Now, they eventually did arrest and try those officers. They were all acquitted. All of them. That's the part of the story people forget. Those officers were acquitted. Yeah. But weren't they just as guilty of the crime as, what Jason Van Dyke did? Because they tried to cover it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's public corruption.
Yeah.
They should have been charged. They should have been found guilty, and they should be sitting in a prison right now. Well, this officer came out and said it. What has her life been like on the force since then? You know what I'm saying? So we have to create avenues to make it easier for cops to report other bad cops. My personal idea, and it's not going to happen with our current person in the Oval Office, and this is something I was upset with Barack about, there needs to be a creation within the Department of Justice or within the FBI where all they do is investigate corruption in law enforcement, where the federal government investigates every time there's a citizen death at the hands of an officer, whether they were choked, whether they were shot, or whatever. There needs to be an independent federal investigation done. As it currently stands, it's kind of a hodgepodge of who investigates who. Most of the time, especially in your larger agencies, they have their internal affairs division investigated, which, we've all said, you've got them investigating their own people. That ain't going to work. Or you got the local district attorney's office, which has to work with that law enforcement agency to get cases proved. Yeah. Well, that ain't an objective investigation that's going to take place.
Not at all.
You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
So, there needs to be a federal agency that does this and walks in and does all these investigations. That's the first thing we can do. The second thing we can do is you have to have almost like whistleblower protection. And I know the officers do have that, but again, they're working in a different kind of environment in law enforcement. enforcement, where, you know, their line is, and the reason why they don't trick on each other is because they'll tell you, well, you know, if I'm out of the call and I'm in trouble and I need to make a call in for backup, I'm afraid they won't come.
That's right. They won't back them up.
You know, they won't back me up, or they'll take their time. Well, that sound like a gang to me.
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like to me.
You know, an officer friend.
Now, you know, law enforcement people get mad when I call them a gang, but y'all doing gang stuff.
Yeah.
You know, so I got to call it what it is. Yeah. So we have to make it where they're comfortable enough to come forward, where they don't feel their life is going to be threatened, where they don't feel their career is going to be taken down. I think you and I talked the last time about the guy in Philadelphia, the big-time commissioner, what he was doing to that female officer.
Yes.
You know, he basically was sexually harassing her and giving her terrible assignments, you know, because she wouldn't get with him. Again, that's a gang. Yeah. that's criminal activity. Yeah. So there have to be avenues created for these officers on police forces where they can feel comfortable with saying, hey, this is wrong. And so I saw something that was beautiful yesterday that took place down in Fort Lauderdale. There was a protest going on. There was a couple officers who got surrounded by a crowd. They had to call for backup. An officer came, you know, to kind of get the crowd off their officers. And there was a black female protester who was there kneeling, both hands in the air, holding the Black Lives Matter sign, kneeling on the ground. And a very large white male officer walked by her as she was kneeling with the protest sign in her hand and shoved her, as he was walking by, shoved her in the back of the head, forcing her like to hit her head on the ground. And Tasha, there was a sister, police officer, who was walking behind him and saw this. She immediately ran up behind him and shoved him, started screaming obscenities at him. What are you doing? This is why they out here protesting to begin with when you do stuff like this. And what happened was the crowd had seen him push her, and it ignited the crowd. Yeah. So she reacted right away like, this is exactly what they out here protesting. And she shoved him, she pushed him, she screamed at him, she was cursing him out. That's the type of stuff we need from the you know, good officers that they claim are on these forces. You need to just be a human being and react right away. So as a result of her, and you know, it was on video, I'm gonna post that video to my page later today. Sure. That officer is now fired. They fired that dude. And the chief of the Fort Lauderdale Police Department came on and said why, and said, hey, I was disturbed by what I saw in the video, but at the same time I was also proud that one of my other officers called this out right away. And that's what needs to happen. And that's what another thing I put on my Facebook page. You know, look, all you officers who claim you good, well, you're not good until you start doing that. Because the fact of the matter is, any of those other three officers could have jumped in and grabbed a boy. They were like, dude, what are you doing?
Right.
And Mr. Floyd would still be here today. Yeah. And not only could they have just done it just off GP, they're bound by their duty and their oath to do it.
That's right.
You're supposed to protect everybody. And if there's a criminal who's in a police costume at the time, then you need to treat that criminal like you would treat anybody else who wasn't in the police uniform. So
I think that is a great note to end on. I really appreciate your insight. We love when you come on the show and share, you know, all of your wonderful Eagle knowledge. We appreciate you. This has been TLC Talk Radio's Tasha Talks. I'm your girl, Tasha. Don't forget to follow us on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course, YouTube. Catch us multiple times a day on TLCTalkRadio.com, 24/7 edutainment. We'll catch you next week.